B92. Serbia calling.
The Magnificent!
Serbia calling.
In 1995, the charity War Child released an album called Help. It featured some of the biggest and best artists of the time, including, amongst others, Oasis, Radiohead, Sinead O'Connor, the KLF, the Charlatans, Blur, Portishead, Nana Cherry and Paul Weller.
Come together right now over me.
It raised £1.25 million, and the proceeds went to help thousands of children caught up in the Bosnian conflict.
We've all the will in the world. Typing Portishead.
The album itself was incredibly all recorded in a single day and released just a week later.
Raindrops keep falling on my head, just like the guy whose feet are too big for his bed.
This September 2020 marks the 25th anniversary of Help, and the album is being re-released for the very first time on vinyl and on streaming platforms, so everyone can hear this remarkable collection of songs. But getting huge stars to record 20 songs in a day and then releasing them in a week wasn't easy, and there's an amazing story to be told about how it happened. That story includes car crashes, private jets, Tony Blair, Johnny Depp, John Lennon and a pregnant bear.
It's getting late now. He knows today that he will shut it out.
So here then in this podcast, with a bit of help from people like Paul Weller and members of Radiohead, the Manic, Salad, the Charlatans and Blur, plus many of the people from behind the scenes, will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth about the making of the greatest charity album of all time.
Today, Billy Joe McAllister jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge.
My name is Matt Everett and this is Help, the story of the War Child album. Episode 2, The Countdown.
War Child was set up to help the children of Bosnia, and we have a mobile bakery, we have an insulin program for diabetic children, and a music and social program. As a result of Help, we will be able to increase our funding of these projects, as well as helping other agencies who are working in similar areas in Bosnia.
That's David Wilson, a writer who, alongside filmmaker Bill Leeson, co-founded War Child, a charity set up in 1993 as a response to the war raging in what was then Yugoslavia. Bill and David visited Sarajevo to make a film for the BBC about Croatian musicians and witnessed firsthand the terrible impact of the war on people, on families, on children. Current War Child CEO Rob Williams.
All charities start with people who are not prepared to put up with what's going on, and those two guys in particular, they were outraged and they acted on it. Our two founders were in Bosnia in 93, so 2 years before the album came out. They scraped together some money, they did some early fundraisers. We didn't make that much money, but they got enough cash together to start to send relief packages over to Bosnia, which is amazing. They're still an inspiration for us now, 25 years later.
As Rob says, their early efforts didn't exactly fill the coffers. Wilson wrote a play called War Child, but the curtain never went up on the production after they worked out that the show would have to run for months and months and months to make any money. It did, however, give the fledgling charity its name. Likewise, the proper first fundraiser turned out to be exactly the opposite, probably what you'd call a fund lowerer. Bill and David booked London's Royal Festival Hall for a 3-night stand featuring a clutch of classical music luminaries, such as pianist Peter Donahoe and cellist Julian Lloyd-Webber. It lost money, but it put War Child in the public eye.
An early breakthrough was they got money from the British government to provide food in Mostar, where the bakeries had been bombed. And they ended up setting up a bakery that fed about 15,000 people a day, which was amazing. And these are people who are not aid workers. They didn't know entirely what they were doing. You know, they were documentary filmmakers, they were musicians. They're quite extraordinary.
Their next venture put War Child in a zoo. In August 1993, over 800 street entertainers, musicians and dancers busked at the world-famous London Zoo near Regent's Park. They raised £25,000. This is despite the fact that in the very last minute they discovered their stage was next to the enclosure of a very rare Madagascan bear, who was pregnant. Her well-being obviously had to be taken into consideration, and the whole stage and the whole setup had to be dismantled and moved elsewhere, in case the jugglers and fire eaters upset her. So what did David and Bill spend their newfound money on? Rob Williams again.
They focused on food and also insulin. There were lots of diabetic children who just weren't getting any insulin. And they were doing, frankly, amazing things. They were getting to parts of Bosnia that were beyond front lines, beyond what a health and safety risk assessment would suggest would be a reasonable place to go. One of our values now is that we need to be bold. And that's about that early group of volunteers really pushing the boundaries on where you could get to with a bunch of insulin and food parcels.
The next two War Child events were crucially of the serious raising money variety. In September 1994, an art auction called Little Pieces from Big Stars raised £80,000, selling works from people including David Bowie, Sir Paul McCartney and Bono. The following June, they staged a fashion show, Pagan Funwear, which raised an amazing £150,000. Their catwalk featured designs by Lou Reed, Brian Ferry and Michael Stipe, and the models included Naomi Campbell's mum and Jarvis Cocker from Pulp, who designed and modelled a rather nice pair of shoes. And it was while putting this show together that War Child made what would turn out to be a fortuitous phone call to a record label called Go Discs. Would Paul Weller fancy designing something, they asked. No, said his label. He's a musician. You'd be better off asking him to do what he does best. This was one of many, many calls made from the War Child office while trying to put together the show, and it wasn't unusual for people to pass. So Weller was crossed off the list and they moved on to the next name on their list. But little did anyone know how important that call would be. War Child had firmly set out their stall with the success of their fashion and art shows, and the idea of enlisting household names wasn't a new one for a charity, but enlisting the kind of names that chimed with a younger audience was. The charity was always on the lookout for new ways to raise funds, holding regular meetings to toss the salad, chew the fat, and work out their next move. There was one new face at one such meeting in early August 1995. That would be Tony Crean from Go Discs, who we all met in episode 1.
I'd sort of forgotten that War Child had been in touch some time before about with one of their art projects to raise money for the charity, and I got back in touch with James Topham, who was at the time was working as an assistant to Brian Eno, and he'd been in touch with me previously about Paul Weller doing something for one of their art projects, and so I got back in touch with James. And he said about going along to a War Child meeting, so I just went along there really to try and get a bit more information. Like that was the day that I met Rob Partridge.
The late, great Rob Partridge, a music industry PR hero who'd worked with people like Bob Marley, U2, Grace Jones, Frankie Goes to Hollywood. His enthusiasm and skills would prove vital for the project. So, as you heard in episode 1, everyone kept talking and thinking until they had the idea.
It sort of popped up that it came along round to me in this meeting, and they said, "Oh well, I believe you've got an idea about doing an album with Blair and Oasis." And I said, "Well, I actually haven't got much of an idea about doing the record. I just thought, there's a war going on, and at the moment, all you're reading about regarding music is this ridiculous so-called Britpop war between Blair and Oasis." And I thought, well, if you could put them both on the same record, you might get some attention. And my background being press and marketing, that was something I thought, well, at least it would put the war in Bosnia back into the music papers, which I thought would be a start. I thought if you achieve nothing else than that, then that might be a start, and that might be enough to stir somebody else's imagination to get something done.
As we now know, the idea involved getting the biggest British bands of the moment to all take part and record an album's worth of brand new tracks in one day. This would form a compilation album which would get mixed, pressed up and distributed and hit the charts the very same week.
If you'd given people a week, they probably, you give people a week, they take a week, give them a day and they do something special.
What's more, Tony and his friends wanted the whole project to start in a month's time. If it worked, the proceeds would go to War Child. Days after the meeting, Tony Crean returned to War Child with a list of artists who'd be up for contributing to the record. Some, like Blur, had been recruited to the War Child cause previously. Here's Blur drummer Dave Rowntree.
Yeah, I knew about War Child because of Tony Crean. He had rung me one day and said sounded like he was having a midlife crisis, and he was a bit of a ducker and diver, bobber and weaver manager. And he rang me up and kind of saying he thought he wanted to give something back. He thought he'd been wasting his time and wanted to give something back and to have a different sort of life. And he was working with this charity called War Child, and was I interested in helping? The purpose was to help children who were often the innocent victims of war, and it sounded like a worthwhile project to me. But anyway, he reached out rather than ask me to do anything specific. So that was probably maybe the year before, maybe in 1994.
Tony Crean.
I went back into the office and I went to speak to my bosses, Andy McDonald and Mike Hennigan, who were both brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and like again really powerful in that. They sort of went, right, okay, let's get this, let's do this. We should do this, definitely. So we went off and had a meeting with War Child in a pub, and I think we were in a fortunate position. We'd had a really good couple of years with Portishead, with Weller, with the beautiful South. We were in a good healthy position, and there was a general desire in the label to do something. This was a label that had been built on people like Billy Bragg and Paul Heaton, so it was a general desire to do something proactive that matched the spirit of the label.
It's worth remembering that they weren't asking for a song that already existed. This had to be something new, a new track, a new version of a song, a collaboration or a cover. This is a big ask. So they knew they had to ask Oasis and Blur. The Stone Roses were theoretically on board. Who else do you approach?
It was very deliberately targeted at some of the more alternative artists as well that we worked with, so it wasn't going to be just the biggest names available, and it wasn't going to be, we were all very much signed up to the idea that it wasn't going to just be one of those albums where it's just a collection of B-sides or, acoustic tracks or something that somebody's out sitting on a shelf. As generous as that can be, it needed to have its own collective energy and collective spirit, and that's what I think worked, because everybody bought into that. They bought into the idea that, well, right, wow, there's some other big of our peers, the people that we admire on this record, and they're doing this record, and you don't want to let anybody down by not doing it as well as possible, and I think that comes through in the music.
Terry Hall, a legend in the music PR world, was also on board.
Do you know, I don't even know if we had a hit list. I think it started with maybe Tony, maybe Rob Partridge, maybe because of his links with War Child already, can we get Paul McCartney to do something here? And it went from there. And it wasn't, I don't remember sitting down with a hit list going, let's call them. I think it was like 1 or 2 phone calls were made. And then there was an avalanche of offers and bands and people doing this. I think from my point of view as the Stone Roses PR and the Manic's PR and the company that looked after Terrorvision as well, once you went back to people and said, we're talking to Paul McCartney, Terry secured the Stone Roses, Manics are on board, everybody was like, yeah. Nobody really needed any persuading on this because it was on your screens. It was next door. There was this genocide going on. So people were like, yeah, we'll help.
So we'll just ask Paul McCartney. Why not? Just asking perhaps the most famous living musician in the history of pop music to get on board is a considerable job. As a bit of background, to put the proper machinery in place to get a famous musician to commit to something is a hugely hard and time-consuming process. For a Damon, a Noel, Nina, Sinead or Macca to do anything, they need to know its sound. There are a lot of questions to answer. Will it be recorded properly? Will it be promoted properly? Who's mixing it? Who's doing the artwork, the distribution, the cover? Tell me everything about the charity. Can you guarantee the money's going to get to who needs it? These things have to be done properly. Without real assurances, bands will, and often do, say no. Suffice to say that normally takes more than a month. Some groups had a connection to Go Discs, others worked with Terry Hall at Hall or Nothing. Ed O'Brien from Radiohead.
Our press officer was the amazing Kathy St. Luce from Hall or Nothing press office, who also managed the Manics. And Terry Hall, who ran it, she was front and centre in this whole project. So it was proposed to us as a very early stage, and I think we just it was just a no-brainer for us. I remember it was just like, this sounds really, obviously the cause is really important, but the idea of it, everybody in a studio for one day recording a track at the same time, it's brilliant concept.
My name is Simon Rowbottom. I was known as Sice in those days, and I was a singer in the Boo Radleys.
Lots of the bands asked, and lots of people generally, didn't understand the complexities of how the conflict came about, and that's fair enough. It's very complex, but they just wanted to help.
It was really strange because we had one of our guys who was doing sound for us was there at the time when the conflict was breaking out, and was describing how sort of frightening it was to actually be in, and actually had to get out of the country. I think he was touring with Babes in Toyland at the time. So we were kind of aware that it was, that it was going on, but the call came through, and I think it was the idea that grabbed us more than anything else, from a creative point of view. This idea of write a song, record it in a day and get out, that grabbed us before anything. And then when we heard about the cause that it was for War Child and heard about what War Child did, we were absolutely, definitely up for it. But it was that idea that thrilled us, actually, that was kind of, this sounds like a really great idea, and it sounded very immediate. It was a bit of a kind of, almost a kind of band-aid for us, that kind of, right, here's something we can give to, here's something we can do.
My name's Lee Marklew, and I'm the bass player for Terrorvision. I mean, we were quite popular at the time, which always helps with these things. Terry Hall from Hall or Nothing was involved in the people that put it together, and they were looking after our press, maybe at the time, or certainly Gillian Porter. So yeah, it is who you know and all that. And I guess they must have wanted a bit of Northern Rough on there amongst all the sort of cultured artistes, a bit of ridiculousness from Oop North. So we fit the bill.
So, who did they get to take part? Oasis, the Boo Radleys, the Stone Roses, Radiohead, Orbital, Portishead, Massive Attack, Suede, the Charlatans with the Chemical Brothers, Stereo MCs, Sinead O'Connor, the Levellers, Manic Street Preachers, Terrorvision, the KLF, Andrew Weatherall and David Harrow, Terry Hall and Salad, Nina Cherry and Trout, Blur, and a supergroup, the Smoking Mojo Filters. Ben Knowles is a former director of music at War Child, and in 1995 he was a reporter at the Daily Mirror.
I mean, it captured British music at an incredible moment, and a moment which is beyond, I think, how Britpop is perceived now, 25 years later, is that it wasn't just Oasis and Blur and Suede. It was Portishead, it was Massive Attack, it was Orbital, it was KLF. It was this incredible diverse collection of British music that was captured on the record. And so many of the tracks individually were huge news stories. Getting the Stone Roses to record a track in 24 hours when they'd taken 5-6 years to get into the studio to record an album was a great story. Getting Blur and Oasis together, this was at the peak of the Blur-Oasis battle in 1995. Getting them on the same record was remarkable. It was the first Manic Street Preachers recording since Ritchie had disappeared. It was the first real vision of what band Radiohead were going to become. This was really a band on the cusp.
War Child were gobsmacked. A lot of the artists who said yes were doing so in the middle of massive success. Oasis were gearing up to release What's the Story Morning Glory. Blur were post-Parklife and about to unveil the Great Escape album. Portishead had just released their stunning debut under a year earlier. And just a few months before that, the Boo Radleys had a colossal career-defining hit with Wake Up Boo. Boo Radleys singer, Sice.
As far as I remember, I think we were probably still kind of riding high on our success, because I think 95, I can't remember when Wake Up Boo, the single, came out, but it was probably March, April time, I think. So that summer had been a big one for us, and there'd been a lot of success, a lot of radio play, the album had gone to #1. So I think at that time, this sort of request felt great. It felt like we were kind of, this is what we're in it for. This is this kind of thing of kind of being wanted, and especially, like I say, doing something creative. It was kind of, get down the studio, write a song. It was really exciting, actually. It was really, I think that time for us, it wasn't a downtime. It was kind of, right, let's fit everything in. So it was really enlivening. It was a really good thing to do.
And within days, our team, based around Tony Crean and music PR gurus Rob Partridge, Anton Brooks and Terry Hall, were putting the pieces into place. Liaising, coordinating, booking, enlisting managers, other PRs, and slowly but surely, the finest British acts of the moment were booked into studios, from Wales to Malaga and most points in between, for a 24-hour recording session set for Monday, September the 4th. Lee Marklew from Terrorvision.
But I do remember being excited by the concept, because when I was a kid, bands used to release an album or two every year, you know what I mean? And it does tend to, when you're part of that machine, it just seems to grind, everything grinds to a bit of a halt, you know, and there's 2 years or 3 years sometimes between albums because of your other commitments. And I just think that just excited us, I think, just being involved in something that was going to be so quick and so sort of spontaneous and obviously, yeah, I mean, just to be asked for some, I mean, the cause was really sort of stuck in our heads at the time. Something we'd want to get involved with. We didn't get involved with much other charity stuff because it's quite personal, I think, charity, but that sort of resonated with all of us. And then obviously being in that company, in the exalted company of those other bands, was you know, I could sit here pretending to be quite cool, but it was quite a thrill for us, you know. So yeah, win-win all round.
No one was here setting themselves up to save the world. They just wanted to do what they could to help. And what they could do to help is create an album that would kick the arse out of every charity record that came before it.
So that was it. So it was the main thing was getting everybody to record on the first day, and then getting it all mastered and turned around on the Tuesday in time to be able to then make the delivery of the master tapes to the factories for the Wednesday, you know, so that they could actually get a full day's crack at it. And straight away you start seeing how basically this was a massive, you know, collective effort from so many different people, because without the people who were prepared to sign up to this in advance to say they would do the sort of the night shift, or they would work flat out all the way through, or they would to some extent put other things on the back burner to make sure this record could get through, and to do that nobody wants their records to get sidelined, so it means an extra shift really. So it was a lot of people putting in an extra shift, you know, and that's the only way it could have actually worked.
It's 1 minute past midnight on Monday, September the 4th, 1995. There was no going back. This was the beginning of a week that all those involved would never forget. Everyone, from Oasis to Portishead, from Radiohead to Nana Cherry, took to the studio at various times during the day. The KLF, Suede, Salad, Terrorvision, Blur, the Charlatans, the Chemical Brothers, all across the world, across the globe, studios buzzed into life as bands began knitting together the tracks that would change the perception of charity records forever. But every session is different. Everyone feels differently under pressure. Will everyone make it? How will the songs turn out? What was it like in those studios? I will try my hardest to answer all those questions in part 3 of Help, the Making of the War Child album.
It was never going to be a cover. It was always going to be, what's our best song? What's our best song right now?
That's my memory of it, you know, just doing Raindrops, Keep Falling on My Head. So it was kind of like a signal, a sound test for us.
So we're all in there, and Macca's in there as well with us playing, and doesn't really get too much better than that for me, man. You know what I mean?
Since the Help album was released in 1995, support from music fans has enabled War Child to reach millions of children whose lives have been torn apart by conflict. Today, with the added threat of coronavirus, War Child's work is more important than ever. You can help them be there for more children and their families by making a donation today. You can find out more at warchild.org.uk/help25. This has been a Cup and Nuzzle production for War Child. Just like before, there's a lot of people to thank, which we will get round to, but I'd like to say a special thank you for downloading, subscribing and listening to this podcast. It's been amazing to see the series so high up in the podcast charts. The work War Child does is incredible. So if this has made you stream the Help album, buy the limited vinyl, donate or just try and find out more, thank you. Until next week, I've been Matt Everett. Thanks for listening.